All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, the land of plotting coffee. This is David and PacWest Bigfoot. Real quick, I just wanted to say this, and I know that most channels out here, platforms, or dudes like me, I guess, here on in the Bigfoot world, we might not mention this, but I do want to say this real quick. I know that our politicians and folks in our country are starting to get a little loud and crazy and trying to start arguments and fights and separate us. And I'll tell you this, that won't happen here. My prayer this year is that whether conservative or whether Republican, Democrat, or independent, doesn't matter. We're Americans. We should be able to sit down, banter back and forth of the different ideas, whether we agree with them or not. And at the end of that, my prayer is this, is that we reach out to our neighbors and that we love our neighbors as ourselves, and that we literally can sit down, and whether we agree or not, we can sit down and still love them, enjoy their presence, and literally sit down, have a conversation over a cup of great Sasquatch Coffee Company coffee. How's that sound? All right. Well, you know what? My prayer this year is that is that you and I can sit down and be American and what that means to you. And so we're going to do that this year, and I'm going to keep you guys in my prayers, and I hope you keep us in your prayers. And I do want to give a shout out, of course, to my good friend William Jevening over at Creek Devil, my good friend Mike over there at Bigfoot's Wilderness, and also Sasquatch Coffee Company, and not to mention Julie and Thomas and Shane, and especially Gunner over there at Monster X Radio. And don't forget, they got some new episodes coming out on YouTube right now. And don't forget, Monster X Radio is actually having a monthly giveaway where Gunner's giving away some really awesome Sasquatch coffee stuff to lucky winners. So you can get over to monsterxradio.com and you guys can subscribe and be a lucky winner. So it's pretty awesome. The coffee's great. Hoodies are awesome. Coffee mugs are cool. So there you go. So with that, let's get into this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. And with that, let's go. Bigfoot stalks cross-country skier. That night, a night I never imagined I would be spending in the cold, dark woods of the Pacific Northwest. I thought it was my last. I truly believed this creature, this Bigfoot thing, was going to get me. It was cold, dark, and the scariest night of my life ever. I'm not sure how I got through it, but I did. And today, well, I have a new aspect of life, and that is to live it like it will end tomorrow, because, as I know, it just might. Here is that night, a night I will never, ever forget. I loved cross-country skiing. I loved cross-country skiing. Rossignol was my brand. Like Nike or Adidas or Under Armour to other athletes, Rossignol was to me in my sport, my pastime, my favorite brand of my newfound hobby at the time. It started back in 1990, but about 2 years later, or more, like 2 winters later, I was branching off into some real cross-country skiing. What I mean by that is that is the fact that I was no noob by that point and felt ready to venture out into the real backcountry. Originally, I was from L.A. My friends all loved the city life and the warm, sunny days at the beaches that edged the Southern California coastline. They were all into surfing, windsurfing, and or boogie boarding. Apparently, I was the odd man out. I suppose because all I could dream of were snow-covered mountains, a pair of cross-country skis, some survival gear in the backpack, and a view of nothing but evergreen forests that stretched into eternity. After about 10 years of living down and around Hermosa Beach, I decided to pack it in for the Pacific Northwest. So I sold my business, a little advertising and marketing agency, my house, which I made a killing on, in all honesty, and took my hoard of cash and dreams and living in the land of evergreen and moved to Southern Oregon. I loved it here then, and I still do now. I spent 2 winters here learning to cross-country ski up around Mount Ashland, and once up around Crater Lake. Each session, I would come up for a class on the sport and hired a coach to help me learn. Of course, I never expected her to become my wife, but she did after a few years later, after we reconnected when I made the move to a small town called Gold Hill, Oregon. We still live here today, and I will bust one surprise out. We still ski a lot. However, it is not without an extra pair of eyes in the back of my head and a gun strapped to my back. That is for sure. You can't cross-country ski without it. The day I met Bigfoot. That day started great. I was ready for my second cross-country skiing session. I was going to start at the rim of Crater Lake and take a trail that led back to Highway 62, where my friend and now wife would leave my car in a turnabout just off the highway and drive me up to the rim of the lake. So she dropped me off up near the Rim Village Visitor Center. It was quite the view, that was for sure. It is a pretty majestic part of creation, Crater Lake. Just knowing that this massive volcano erupted at one point, well, a sense of awe is what most feel when they lay eyes on this place for the very first time. I was in awe, and twice that day. I pulled everything out of the SUV and watched her drive off, heading back to Jacksonville where she lived. I was ready for the next 4 or 5 hours of fun. Yes, most cross-country skiing sessions takes about 2 to 4 hours, but today I wanted to stop at the Lady of the Woods for a few for lunch, then finish off the last half, ending at Highway 62 by late afternoon. I had everything I needed, even emergency supplies, in a small pup tent packed away just in case, and boy did I need it. There were some folks up there at the lodge, but being the dead of winter, only a few, mostly photographers it seemed to be. I recall as you could see, a few people walking around with tripods over their shoulders with a camera attached. Once I was all strapped in and ready to go, I hit the trail. Literally, a trail that would lead me to the Lady of the Woods. It was a perfect day, cloudy, and some snow was still falling, and more was called for that night. Actually, and unfortunately for me, a small storm was what I would find myself in the midst of. My fear was not that. Mine was always of getting hurt and having nobody around to see my flare go up. However, fears apparently come in all shapes and sizes in the Pacific Northwest, even in the shape of a giant, hairy monster of the woods. I'd gotten pretty far down the trail, moving at a pretty good click, when I started feeling that weird hair on the back of your neck feeling that you get when you know you're supposed to be alone, but you know you're not. I stopped for a moment, put my ear to the ground, as they say, by listening for anything out of the ordinary that, by that point, I've come to learn in the woods about Southern Oregon. I heard the wind howl a bit. I heard the limbs of a million coniferous trees move and wave about in that very wind. Then, well, I thought I heard a howl, and not the kind the wind makes. I thought it was a coyote or perhaps a wolf, although they were so rare it was not funny. I believed I was correct and figured the sound was so faint that it could have been anything or nothing at all. I moved on. Finally, I reached the Lady of the Woods, and there is where everything changed, and quickly. She cut me off. I would stop for a snack, real quick, replenish my energy and fluid intake. It was starting to snow again. This time, however, the snow started to become heavier, with thick flakes. Not to mention, low clouds started to move in through the trees. Visibility was getting a bit harder. That made me worry a bit, as it would any cross-country skier. And, again, I heard a distant howl. Still far off was the sound, but I felt, well, a chill go down my spine all of a sudden. It had nothing to do with the weather turning a bit bad or the cold it brought with it. This was out of, well, fear. I shook it off and started thinking about my wife, Shelley, well, who would eventually be my wife. I started thinking and daydreaming a bit about her and life, and soon the chills left and the wind picked up a bit. I needed to move on just in case the weatherman was wrong. And he was wrong. Dead wrong. About 5 minutes later, I was in the middle of a drift so thick I could barely make out the trees not 40 yards away. And the howling got louder and closer. The chills down my spine and back were back as I came to a stop. I listened closely to the sound and tried to determine what direction it came from. I knew my way out, the direction I needed to head in. I put my compass away and started on with the rest of my track. As I did so, I suddenly caught some movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a snow load falling off a nearby tree, but it wasn't. It took me a moment to realize it, but I caught myself looking at a tree swaying in the wind back and forth. However, this tree was had a humanoid shape to it, and that is when I realized it was a person. At least at first, that is what I thought. I stared at them, my heart beating faster now. They were literally standing in the path I needed to head, right in the middle of it. I could not make out much about them as they were covered in all black, like one of those military suits. I forgot what they call them, but snipers and special ops, I suppose, use them. They did not move towards me. They just kept swaying back and forth in one spot. I pulled my rifle from over my back and held it tightly. At that, this person turned and walked away. And that is when I started questioning whether or not that was a human being at all. It must have been crouched, because when it turned, it also stood up on two legs. I could see it was massive and tall. This had to be a Portland trailblazer, pun intended, hiking down the trail I was on. It was tall, covered in black, which turned out to be hair, and the girth of its waist was not all that big, but its shoulders, well, they were huge and seemed extremely muscular. I decided to head straight down and just left of the trail and steer clear of whomever or whatever this thing or person was. Peekaboo. I started heading off and did not get 100 yards when that thing, and this time I knew it was not human, stood again right in my path. I stopped and noticed this time that it had almost no neck, and that was hair that covered its body. It was not a weird military suit at all. Again, I brandished my rifle after retaking it off my back. This large, massive beast of a thing, did not move. It simply started swaying back and forth, looking right at me. I turned and headed back into the direction I came in, but constantly looking over my shoulder to see if this thing was following me. I did not see it. Apparently it had moved on. Well, at least I hoped it did. I got back to the main trail and decided I would head to my destination from there. Finally, and without any more visuals of that thing, whatever it was, I was back to a pretty good pace, even though the weather did not get any better. I must have made it half a mile when the howling resumed, and yes, even closer. I knew what was making that eerie and awful sound by that point. I stopped, listened again, and then noticed directly in front of me, not 40 or so yards, that monster stood right in my path again. However, this time a scream I never want or wish to hear again came from this thing and was directed right at me. I knew I was in trouble. I knew my life would cease to exist if I did not get away from this thing and fast. I took out my rifle, fired off a shot in the air, and started heading downhill as fast as possible. I bit it. Seriously, not a minute later, with the snow falling in a complete and utter shower, I did not see the drop-off and took a spill, practically breaking my ankle. I heard that howl from not far away. I felt as though I was being hunted or herded. Either way, I was busted up in a slight blizzard and with a crazy monster of the woods on my tail. I could not go on. I looked at my watch and realized that inside the next 2 hours, I was going to be a missing person. I knew that was a good thing if I could not make it back to the trail and my destination. At least by then, Shelley would call for help, and hopefully, help would come before I met some unfortunate end at the hands of what I knew now was Bigfoot. I could not move. The pain was horrible. I did have some ibuprofen, so I took 3. It was a hairline fracture for sure. I knew it, and there was no way I was getting out of that spot for a while. Once the pain subsided a bit, I tried to leave, but I could not be on that ankle in that ski boot. It hurt far too much. Again a howl, and again I looked in the direction it came from, and yes, again I saw this thing swaying back and forth between a clump of trees not far from me, like it was playing a deadly game of peekaboo. Fright night. It was getting dark and fast. The snow had let up, finally, but the cloud cover made it darker, ominous even. It was time to hunker down and hope for rescue, and hopefully before the sun went down completely. I kept snow on my ankle, which, combined with the chill factor outside, made it numb, which made it feel better. However, I had to relent on that because I did not want to get frostbite. I started a fire, pitched the pup tent, and kept watch out for that hairy beast of a thing that I swear was either hunting me or simply interested in getting me out of the area. The howls returned too, and just before sunset. I saw it there, walking from one side of a small ridge directly in front of me about 50 yards away. It would stop, howl, and move off again, out of sight, only to return moments later. I was scared, I have to admit. This thing was massive, like that old video down in Northern California massive. I knew it could probably take me at any time it wanted to, and I was glad to have my rifle with me, though. I'm not sure, but I think that thing knew what a gun was, because strange as it may sound, every time I brandished it, that thing moved off fast. I finally fell asleep. It was warm in my bag, and I got up to stoke the fire here and there. Again, at about 4 to 5 a.m., I got up, stepped outside to stoke that fire up one last time before the sun would come up about an hour later. The stench, however, was unbearable, to say the least. It was like garbage, nasty rotten meat and roadkill all rolled into one. And then came a growl I never expected. It was deep, menacing. And as I looked up and out past the fire, not 20 feet from me stood a female Bigfoot. She had to be all of 8 to 9 feet tall, the hair long and gangly almost everywhere, here and there. Her body was covered in it, from head to toe, minus parts of her face. She had a chest on her, a female chest, so I assumed it was female. She stood there, slightly bent at the waist, breathing heavily in and out, and in between growling at me still. I thought she would charge me. I realized I had my rifle in my hand. Slowly I brought it up to my shoulder and pointed it at her. Her eyes went big, and they glinted green. There was a greenish glint to them. Again she growled, but as she did, she turned and started moving off. I watched as she stopped and again looked back at me. As she did, I noticed a smaller figure, dark and covered in hair as well, come out from a row of low shrubs. Next, as it moved off into the dark, a scream came from the same direction, a scream that literally had me shivering in my boots, and not from the cold and snow that began to fall once again. 45 minutes later, I was startled again by yelling and screaming. These, however, well, they were human, and they were yelling my name. I cannot tell you how relieved I was. Out and about. I still cross-country ski today with my wife. Not much, but here and there when we can. She saw the tracks, so she knows I was telling the truth. And while she says she'd love to see one, I for sure do not. Thanks, Trevor.